So this morning, I want to continue the devotional series that I've been doing called Time is Ticking Away, How to Make the Most of Your Time. And so today is part 4 of 5. And so how do we make the most of our time? We know that we have a limited amount of time. Even if we, as I mentioned the other day, even if we live to 100, 110, that's still a really short time and comparing it to God's time. And so, how do we make the most of the time that we've been blessed with and been given on this earth? Given two principles already. On Tuesday, we talked about having the proper perspective of our time and how we need to view it biblically, scripturally, and understand the time that we have. And then on Wednesday, the second principle is you must pursue God's will for your time. You must pursue God's will for your time. And yesterday I talked about how to do that. We talked about God's general will and God's specific will, and mentioned some things about understanding God's general and specific will and what that means to us. And so the second principle then was pursuing God's will for our time. So how do we make the most of our time? Well, the third principle that I want to share with you today is you must purposely organize your time. And we see this in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. You must purposely organize your time. Let me read Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. You might, when you hear it, I bet you're going to recognize it because it's a passage that is pretty familiar. So it says there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. Now, if you've never heard that anywhere, I would be surprised because most people at least have heard a few verses from the movie Footloose as they were arguing their case to have their senior prom, their senior dance. He quoted part of this in that movie. So if you haven't heard it anywhere else, you may have heard it there, at least part of it. So how do we manage our time? How do we organize our time? There's this example in the Old Testament that I think is relevant to this. In the Old Testament, Moses has been used by God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt and toward the promised land. Now, as Moses is doing this, his father-in-law Jethro comes to visit him. And we see this in Exodus 18. And so Jethro comes to visit, and he's just observing Moses. He's just watching what Moses is doing day in and day out. And so he noticed that Moses served as judge for the people. And he did it from morning to evening, and he would listen to all of their complaints, and he would tell them God's will. Jethro, he confronted Moses, his son-in-law, and said, Moses, this isn't good. What you're doing, you're going to wear yourself out. You're not going to be able to function anymore and lead these people. And so Jethro noticed this. He brings it up to Moses, and then he made a suggestion to Moses that I think is significant. Jethro told Moses, he said, you need to break the people into groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And Moses, you need to train the leaders of the people who know God, they know his word, and let them minister to the people. And so by doing this, Moses then would only handle the highest level situations that came his way. Moses had to learn to organize the people so that he could organize his own time better. And for us, we have to learn to purposely organize our time. And it's not always easy. I mean, let's face it, we have things pulling at us and drawing us away if we're not careful. And, it's challenging to stay focused, to stay on purpose. And I saw some old research. It is old, so let me qualify it, but it was by Forbes magazine. It was published in Forbes magazine, and they said the number one factor for success or failure was time management. Now, I'm not perfect at this. I mean, I do have some boundaries that I keep in place, and so believe me when I tell you, this is a principle that I'm learning and constantly, for me, it's a moving target. It's not something I've learned and I just naturally do. It's a moving target to kind of try to stay focused. But just some suggestions on how to organize our time. One is we do need to do what we mentioned yesterday and discern God's will. God does have a general will, a specific will, and I'm really talking about the specific will here. What's God's purpose for you? What has God created you to do? And that's going to differ for us. That's going to differ for each of us because God created each of us special, unique, with a certain personality and skill set and all of those things that go into our lives. And He's done that. And because He's done that, we need to discern God's will. But then once we do that, we need to write down our God-given priorities. Okay, and I'm assuming God and church and family are going to be on that list. But more specifically, what are some of the priorities that are your God-given priorities? Write them down. Just brainstorm. Just come up with whatever. Just spill it all out on a piece of paper. List everything you can think of. And then after you do that, go through them. Give it a little time, go through them, mark off the ones that aren't really your priorities, number the ones that are. What is your first priority? What is your second priority? What is your third priority? And try to be specific. And then for those priorities, what kind of actions need to be taken with those priorities? For me, a priority I have every week is our Sunday worship service. And so there's certain things, I need to plan the service, prepare the PowerPoints, prepare a pastoral bulletin. I do that every week so that, it'll help me to better lead the service. I need to prepare the prayers for the service, and I prepare the prayers every week. I need to prepare a message for Sunday. And so those are things that are a priority for me, and I do them every week. And so I have certain days I typically do certain things on. And, some of them I can do easily and quickly, but like preparing the message, normally that's a 2 to 3 day thing. And I split it up into parts, like study the scripture, and then, what's the main message, or what's the message that I'll be bringing? And then how am I going to communicate that message? And so there's various things that, I do like that. Now, your priorities are going to be different than mine. Your deadlines are going to be different than mine. Certain things I need to do every week, certain things I only need to do every few weeks. But you write them on a calendar. And if you have something that's a deadline, say, 3 months away, well, start with the 3 month and then back your way up, break it into pieces, back your way up, and logically, what steps do you need to do to have that complete? So there's, things that we can do to help ourselves. And I'm just throwing out suggestions, honestly. I'm just throwing out suggestions to you this morning. But we need to organize our time to accomplish our God-given goals. We need to organize our time to accomplish our God-given goals, because time Time is ticking away, and we want to make the most of the time that we've been given. So thank you very much for joining me this morning, and